Hi everyone, welcome to this session. In the previous sessions, we discussed the mechanism of Fed fund rate determination and how Federal Reserve System announced the target Fed fund rate, and in order to attain that, how they also fix the discount rate and the interest rate on reserves, and after that, and how do they operate, that the open market operation, using the open market operation and the discount window, how do they attain the desired, the target Fed fund rate. And then we found that actually after that the market will be finally deciding, at the end the market will be determining the Fed fund rate, and finally what we are going to get, the average of the equilibrium Fed fund rate, we call it as effective Fed fund rate. In this session we are going to see how Fed is using the three major tools of monetary policy to affect the Fed fund rate. Here we are going to discuss how, for example, changes in open market operation, using open market operation, and how Federal Reserve System is able to fix the Fed fund rate by changing open market operation policy, the purchase and sale, and how they affect the Fed fund rate. And subsequently we are going to discuss how changes in the discount rate, that the borrowed reserve, that the discount window, using that how they affect the Fed fund rate. And after that we are going to discuss how changes in reserve requirement, and as well as the changes in the interest rate on reserve requirement affect Fed fund rate. So let's start with the first one, that is the changes, the effects of open market operations. So how changes in the open market operations affect Fed fund rate. So here the effects of an open market operation, it depends on whether the supply curve, the supply of reserve curve, initially intersects the demand curve in its downward sloped section vis-a-vis its flat section. So we have seen that the demand curve, it has the downward slope section as well as it has the flat section. So we are going to see that when the supply curve initially intersected the demand curve in its downward slope section, and then how does it affect the Fed fund rate. So coming, this is the graphical representation. Here our assumption is that when intersection occurs at the downward sloped section of the demand curve, that means looking at this, what we are going to show here is an open market purchase causes Fed fund rate to fall, whereas an open market sale causes the federal fund rate to rise. So the initial equilibrium position is this, that you can see the demand curve intersect the supply curve at this point, and accordingly we can see that this is the federal fund rate FFR equilibrium FFR. And at this point the quantity demanded and quantity supplied in the market is going to be this much. This is the demand supplied and as well as the quantity demanded in the market. So this is the equilibrium quantity, that is the equilibrium where the demand is equal to supply. Now you can also see here the interest rate, the flat section of the demand curve. We know that this is the interest rate on reserve, and this one, the top part, the upper part, this one is the discount rate, that is the bank, the rate at which the banks can borrow from the Federal Reserve System. Now let us see, when we saw that the Fed engage in open markets purchase. So when they make open market purchase, that means they are purchasing the government securities from the banking system, and as a result the net proceeds of the purchase, it will be credited into the account of the banks who sold their securities to the Fed, and then in this process we can see that NBR, it become NBR 1. That means the Fed injects some more reserve into the banking system, which we call here non-borrowed reserve, that is through open market operation. So finally the new intersection point is this one. So what we can see that when the Fed is purchasing government securities, Fed is purchasing government securities, step 1 we can say that the supply curve shift to the right. So this is what we are seeing here, the supply curve is shifting rightwards, and the new equilibrium point, initial equilibrium point, let us call it initial position number 1, and this is 2, and the new equilibrium rate of interest, that the new Fed fund rate is going to be this one. This is the new FFR. New FFR Fed fund rate is this point. So at this rate, obviously we know that there is a downward sloping demand curve. So when the Fed fund rate decline, when there is more reserve in the banking system, then as a result, when there is more reserve in the banking system, the demand for reserve, as a result, because of the supply, more supply in the market, the price, the Fed fund rate decline, and then the member banks who are is borrowing from the Fed fund market, and they move along the demand curve like this, they move along, and then that means they will be demanding more, they will be demanding more. When the price decline, they will be demanding more, then the new quantity demanded and supply, this is going to be the new demand, new demand for reserve, and the new demand for new supply for reserve. So this is the new equilibrium point, and accordingly we can say that the Fed fund rate, it causes an open market purchase by Fed, leads to, it causes the federal funds rate to fall. Okay. So this is one of the impact. Suppose given that the intersection of the supply curve happen at the downward sloped section of the demand curve. So this is scenario 1. Then let us see what is going to happen when the intersection occurs at the flat section of the demand curve. Suppose this is the initial intersection point, where you can see the open market operations have no effect on the federal fund rate. So initially, if this is the intersection point, we know that the FFR is equal to the interest rate on, here you can see that FFR is equal to the interest rate on reserve, right, interest rate on reserve, and because the intersection happens at the horizontal position, section of the flat section of the demand curve, and this is at this point, we can see that there is the NBR that we are showing. This is the NBR, this much is the NBR we assume, and this is the equilibrium position. Now let us see when there is an open market purchase. When there is an open market purchase, you can see that there is no change. What the outcome, we can say that as a result of the open market purchase, the demand curve, the supply curve shift to the right, the supply curve is shifting to the right. Then however, we can see that there is no change in the Fed fund rate, because we have seen that in the previous classes sessions, that means Fed fund rate will never go below the interest rate on reserves, right. We have seen that, because the reason is that in case if it goes, the Fed fund rate is below the interest rate on reserve, then it is better for no one will lend there, because it is better to put all the reserve, keep all reserve as excess reserve with the, so if they have extra fund, that means excess reserve, just keep in the Fed account, and then they will be getting the interest rate, the interest on reserve. So no point in lending in the Fed fund market at a lower rate, lower than the interest rate on reserve. Okay, so that means it will never go below, the Fed fund rate will never go below the interest rate on reserves. So what is the likely impact? So one, we saw that here as a result of open market purchase, the supply curve, that the NBR curve has shifted rightwards, but the Fed fund rate cannot fall below the interest rate paid on reserve. So as a result, there is no change in the Fed fund rate. And what if we say that there is a Fed, instead of Fed market, that open market purchase, what if Fed engage in a open market sale? That means selling government securities to the banking system and getting the net proceeds, that collecting that net proceeds from them. So that means immediately you can see that when the banking system banks purchase government securities from the Fed, then the immediate impact is that they have to pay, and obviously the reserve in the banking system declining, right? Then the reserve in the banking system will be declining. So as a result, still, if it's still the intersection happen at the horizontal part of the demand curve, then there is no change in the interest, that Fed fund rate. In contrast to that, further, suppose if the objective of the Fed is to increase the Fed fund rate, then they have to reduce the reserve with the banking system. Then the option here is that open market sale. That means keep on selling more and more government securities to the banking system. Then that means the curve is shifting leftwards, the supply curve is shifting leftwards. Then you can see that now the intersection is happening at the downward section of the demand curve. So now you can see that this is the new Fed fund rate, that means it is greater than the initial Fed fund rate. That means Fed fund rate increases if the intersection happen at this point. So we can see that if they want to keep on, if the Fed thinks that they would like to increase the Fed fund rate, then the option is to, again you can see that increase just to do more and more open market open market sale. Then you can see that the equilibrium rate is Fed fund rate is increasing. So in that way, if they keep on doing, suppose if they want to, the objective of the Fed is to increase the Fed fund rate, then the option is to do more and more open market sale, that is selling government securities to the banking system. Then as a result, reduce the reserve with the banking system. Then you can see that the new intersection is going to be here, right? So the curve is going to be like this. So this is the way using the open market operation, Fed influence the Fed fund rate. This is one of the tool. So now we are going to discuss how changes in the using the another tool, using the tool of discount window, how if the Fed is going to affect the Fed fund rate. Again, in order to discuss here, what we need to again consider that, in order to say that the position of the supply curve and as well as the demand curve. So that is actually important, very important. The true real effect, the actual effects of any policy depends on what is the position of demand curve and what is the position of the supply curve, and especially the intersection, the position of the intersection of supply and demand curve, whether it is at the vertical section or at the horizontal section. Again, we need to think about the horizontal section of the demand curve, horizontal section of the supply curve, and as well as about the demand curve as well, whether at vertical or at the horizontal part. So here we are going to see that if the intersection of supply and demand occurs on the vertical section of the supply curve, that is one scenario. We can visualize multiple scenario, but for the sake of simplicity to manage our discussion, let us make a few reasonable scenario. Let us see what is the likely impact. So here our first scenario is that when the intersection of the supply and demand occurs at the vertical section of the supply curve. So the interaction of the demand and supply occurs at the vertical section of the supply curve. This is the intersection point. Again we can say that this is the equilibrium interest rate, and this is the quantity demanded and quantity supplied. The quantity of reserve demanded and supply is equal to this much, right. So, this is the initial equilibrium position, and this one anyway you are clear, that is the this is the interest rate on reserve, this is the discount rate, you are clear by now, discount rate. Let us see the what happens here. Suppose there is a change in the discount rate, there is a change in the discount rate. Let us see present it. Lowering the discount rate shift the supply curve down, right. So, this is going to be the new supply curve, supply of reserves. So, you can see that now the supply curve is going to be like that, this way, right. This is the new supply curve. So, this is actually the supply curve shift down, supply curve shift the supply curve down, this is the new supply curve. So, what happened that initially this is the interest rate on discount, and new interest rate on the new discount rate is this one now, right. Now, what we have seen here is that Fed has reduced the discount rate. When Fed is reducing the discount rate, obviously you know that the supply curve is shifting downwards, right. The supply curve is shifting downwards. Let us see. So, but since the intersection happened at the downward sloping position of the demand curve, we are going to say that there is no change in the Fed fund rate, because intersection is still at this point, though here the supply curve shifted downwards. We are going to see that no discount lending happens here. That means the borrowed reserve, that through the discount window, the borrowed reserve is still 0 here. That means the supply in this market consists coming mainly fully from the non borrowed reserve. That means this much is the supply in the market. So, no discount lending here. Then as a result, because the thing is the intersection is here, because always for us the Fed fund rate, the equilibrium Fed fund rate will be at a position point where supply of reserve is equal to demand for reserve. So, our intersection point is this one. So, we see that there is no effect even when they reduce the discount rate, but if they keep on reducing, then we are going to see there are some changes happening. Suppose if they reduce further, if they keep on reducing like that, then the supply curve is going to be the interacting at this point. So, you can keep on see that actually, then the here it will be equal to here, then after that the new intersection will be here, then the FFR will be declining, right. So, you can keep on when the Fed is reducing the discount rate, then we can see that the curve will be shifting downwards further and further. Then the intersection, because this is the supply curve anyway, this is the supply curve that coming from the BR component. This much is from coming from FF, that NBR. After this is whatever is coming due to the change in the discount rate, that is coming from BR part, right, the borrowed reserve. So, let us now see a new scenario, another scenario, when the intersection of supply and demand occurs on the horizontal section of the supply curve. On the horizontal section of the supply curve. So, here a change in the discount rate shifts that portion of the supply curve, and the Fed fund rate may either rise or fall depending on the change in the discount rate. So, here the initial equilibrium point is here. You can see that the FFR, the equilibrium FFR is equal to the discount rate, right. The equilibrium happens at this point, that the happen at the BR part of section of the supply curve. That means here there are some discount lending. So this distance, so this much is what I am marking in red color, this much is coming from the BR component, this much is the BR component, and this much is supply, the demand and supply in the market coming from the NBR component, that is through the open market operation, right. So this is the total quantity demanded and supplied, and of this the first part is NBR and second part is BR. This is the initial equilibrium position where we can see that the Fed fund rate is equal to the discount rate. The equilibrium Fed fund rate is equal to the discount rate. Let us now take the steps, visualize what if the Fed is going to reduce the discount rate. When the Fed is going to reduce the discount rate, you know that at this position, suppose initial equilibrium is at this position, then lowering the discount rate shift the supply curve down, then you know that this is the new supply curve. New supply curve is this one, S1 of reserves, and you can see the new equilibrium position is this one. Here you can see the discount rate, the Fed fund rate is going to be this is going to be the new Fed fund rate, new, and the also equal to the new discount rate is also going to be equal to the new discount rate, and here the new quantity demanded and supplied is this much, and of this you know that this part, this much part is going to be the borrowed reserve component, and this much is the NBR component, non borrowed, that is from open market operation, and this part BR part is from through the discount window. So what we have seen here is that when the intersection of the supply and demand curve occurs on the horizontal section of the supply curve, then at that point of time the discount window is going to make an impact in the Fed fund market. That means if the intersection is happening at this kind of section, that the slope that what we mentioned here, then you can see that the change in discount rate, the reduction in discount rate is going to make an impact. So similarly we can also see that what if they increase the discount rate. If they increase the discount rate, suppose then you know that the new, suppose if they keep increasing, then you can see that the curve will be shifting upwards. So we can keep on increasing discount rate. When they are keeping increasing the discount rate, we can say that this one is S2 of R, S3 of R, S4 of R. So that means they are actually increasing the ID, they are increasing the ID discount rate. When they keep on increasing the discount rate, then you can see that is above this point, the new intersection is happening here, so is not making any impact. That means the demand and supply curve, where the intersection point, we need to look at that. So the discount, then you can see that the Fed fund rate increases. Now let us see how changes in the tools of another monetary policy tool, that is changes in reserve requirement, how does it affect the Fed fund rate. So here we are again visualizing two scenario. What if Fed raises reserve requirement, that is one. Another one is what if when Fed reduces the discount rate. So we are going to see that when the Fed raises a reserve requirement, we are going to see that the Fed fund rate is rises. Fed fund rate rises. So in contrast, when the Fed decreases reserve requirement, the federal fund rate falls. So let us see both scenario. This is our initial equilibrium position, where we can say this is the equilibrium FFR. Now see what is going to happen when the Fed increase the reserve requirement. So, we can see that when the Fed is increasing the reserve requirement, keeping other things, that means there is no change in even the Fed fund rate, you know that the banking system, the borrowing banks, they will be forced to borrow more, and at the same rate they are actually willing to borrow more, right? They will be because they need to meet the reserve requirement. Suppose initially it was suppose 10%, that is the initial, that is at this curve initial RR is equal to 10%. What if the new RR is going to be 15%? Then you know that the curve will be shifting rightwards, the curve will be shifting, because they need to same rate, they are actually willing to, the banks are willing to borrow more. So, as a result, you can say that the increase in the reserve requirement shift the demand curve to the right. So, as a result, what you can see that they actually forced to borrow more, and as a result this is the new intersection point, this is the initial equilibrium position, this is the new equilibrium position. You can see that this is the new Fed fund rate, the new equilibrium position is this one. So, what we have seen here is that when the Fed increases the reserve requirement, it will put that the demand for reserve will be increasing in the market, and it will put an upward pressure in the Fed fund rate. Then as a result, so assuming that there is no change in the reserve, that means when we are increasing the reserve requirement, we assume that in this diagram there is no increase in the NBR or BR, that means there is no open market purchase or open market purchase. So, in case if they do, for example, if they see that in case in this scenario to keep the same FFR, they can do simultaneously. They can, for example, they see that okay, they are increasing the reserve requirement, but they do not want to see, Fed does not want to see the FFR is increasing. In that way, one option is to increase the NBR, this much, that means open market purchase. Then you know that the same equilibrium position happen. This won't happen, this won't happen, and this will be happening provided that there is open market purchase. But in this diagram we are just assuming that there is no open market purchase by the Fed. Fed just suppose if they want to increase the Fed fund rate by using the reserve requirement, then they can do in this way, that means increase the reserve requirement, and as a result increase the reserve requirement, and as a result you can see that the Fed fund rate will be increasing. What if they reduce the reserve requirement? What if they, because here initial equilibrium position is this FFR equilibrium position, and if they reduce the reserve requirement, we can see that the new equilibrium position is going to be here, the Fed fund rate is going to decline. Fed fund rate is new Fed fund rate is going to be this is nothing but this is equal to the interest rate on reserve. So, what we have covered here, we have discussed 3 tools, and in the open market operations, discount window, and as well as changing in the reserve requirement. And in the next session we will continue this discussion and see what if they change the interest rate on reserve and what are the likely impact. Thank you. See you in the next session.